Welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm Christine Barrington. Sadly, many of us in this region have heard of and observed sudden oak death. But how many of you have heard of sudden oak life? Well, tonight our show focuses on this promising solution, researched, practiced, and advanced by my guest, Dr. Lee Klinger. There is mounting evidence that the increased mortality of oaks and other fire-adapted trees in California is linked to long-term fire suppression practices. Given that reintroduction of fire is not feasible in many areas, a suite of practices that mimic the effects of fire are showing promise in restoring the health of oaks and other native trees. My guest is going to guide us through the historical role of Indigenous tending practices and the science and methods of fire mimicry, which reflect many of these ancient cultivation practices known to the original people of this continent. Dr. Lee Klinger is an independent scientist living on unceded Esselen land in Big Sur, California. Since 2005, he has served as director of Sudden Oak Life, a movement aimed at using ecologically based tending practices to address the problem of forest decline in California. He has over 40 years of field experience in the earth system sciences and has held scholarly appointments at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, the University of Colorado, the University of Oxford, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and the Geological Society of London. Well, Dr. Klinger, thank you so much for coming back to Talk of the Bay.
Thank you, Christine.
I'm so happy to have you here. I want to start off by simply asking the question, because you are practicing methods called sudden oak life. Let's start with, what is sudden oak death?
Well, sudden oak death, as defined by the University of California scientists and others, is a disease caused by an organism called Phytophthora ramorum. It's not a fungus, it's technically a water mold, an mycete, often thought to be a fungus, and it is causing stem canker disease in many of the oaks and resulting in the mortality of those oaks, at least the ones that are diseased. To be clear, I'm not an expert in sudden oak death. My focus, since sudden oak death is really focused on a pathological organism, my focus rather is on the ecological mechanisms involved in oak mortality.
Right. You have this really big picture. And so we're going to get into that. And so I'd like to start with your kind of movement and these practices that you call sudden oak life, which encompasses much, much more than just dealing with this one pathogen. Had it start in your life quite a ways back. Could you explain to our listeners how you got interested in forest ecology health and what led you to specifically develop ideas around fire mimicry?
Yeah, well, I have quite a history in tending the forest. I actually built a cabin, partly out of log, up in the Colorado mountains in my early 20s, and lived there for many years off the grid and using essentially the surrounding forest as my heat source and building materials, learning to take out the dead trees, thinning the forest, making the area around my cabin fire safe. And it was all rather intuitive. It wasn't anything taught to me. And it was actually a wonderful time. And then that led really to pretty sincere interest in botany and ecology. I was doing undergraduate studies in the late 70s and eventually went to graduate school at the University of Colorado, started studying forest ecology, environmental biology, and in that period, I was taking time in the summers to make money. I was doing construction work, but then I spent a couple summers traveling to Alaska, where I worked as a logger, partly because I was a member of the local, well, actually, it was the campus environmental group. And at the time, there was quite an anti-logging effort. And here I am living in my cabin, you know, doing selective logging. And I needed to find out more. So I went up to Alaska, spent 2 summers logging to really understand the issue with logging. And there are issues. But really what I learned was that there is significant shifts in the health of the forests in Alaska, as well as in Colorado and elsewhere. And it was that attempt to understand how the forests are changing, the role of acidification became very clear to me, working both in Southeast Alaska. Eventually, I worked in Southeast Alaska studying the successional changes, the developmental changes in ecosystems over time, and in that case, over thousands of years, documenting the changes in ecosystem development. So ecosystems, I'm going to go off on a tangent here, but it's important to understand that all living systems go through life cycles, developmental cycles. Cells do, organisms do. We have
do.
a life cycle of, infancy to adolescence to maturity to old age. So do ecosystems. And these changes are always present. They're essentially a constant force in all ecosystems. And it's very subtle and it's very gradual. And the changes occur over hundreds and hundreds of years. So that's what I ended up studying. And I've taken a lot of that information and particularly keying in on the role of mosses and lichens and the acidification of soils in the health of the forests. And it just started making sense to me after doing quite a bit of research over the years. It became clear that there were ways to deal with the essentially the decline of forests that we're seeing in many places.
Yes. And, for me, somebody had sent me an hour-long presentation that you have on YouTube. I have a page for the show already up on ksqd.org, so if people are interested, you can pull it up if you're at home. But I have included this presentation that you gave, and you showed pictures, and it really revolutionized my prejudices, I would say, versus my ignorance. Like, I have this prejudice that, you just let nature do her thing and she takes care of it. And it's kind of true, or it's totally true, except that humans can interact with our natural landscapes and actually enhance it, kind of like this idea of keystone species. Like, we can become an integrated part of that ecosystem and enhance what's going on, or we can get in there and really mess things up. And with fire suppression, we've kind of messed things up, haven't we?
Yeah. It's funny because when I worked in Southeast Alaska, there were a number of things that to back up, I went to Southeast Alaska to do this work on development of ecosystems because it was a place that I sensed there was very little human activity interfering with the developmental process in ecosystems. And then I ran into some strange findings that I just couldn't explain, other than the native people in Southeast Alaska manipulating the ecosystems and creating these conditions. And that, along with a number of other things that have come up in my work here in California, has really highlighted a real blind spot in the education, my education, but the education of many ecologists who haven't been really made aware of the role of Indigenous tending in shaping the ecosystems we're looking at. So many times we want to just believe that these systems that we're looking at are just, Mother Nature doing what she does best. But when you run into a 1,000-year-old oak tree, which is an early successional tree in the middle of the forest, that's hard to explain. It's just Mother Nature acting alone. There
Well, we're
are
gonna
clearly, yeah,
right. We're
yeah,
gonna get into like how that happened, and it makes me think about.
yeah.
We have a local professor and author here in this area named Stan Rushworth. He's just come out with a beautiful book about traditional ecological knowledge with Darja Mail. And I took classes from him, and he taught me that, the indigenous people cultivated the forests and the prairies extensively. And I was just shocked at that idea and the reality of it, that this beautiful continent just burgeoning with life and wildlife. It was a paradise. Wasn't that way just because, all by itself. And so these accounts that we read of explorers showing up and just seeing this incredible world, part of that is natural beauty, and a big part of it was the indigenous people are part of Mother Nature, and they were using their intelligence to cultivate this beautiful world, to provide everything that they needed. And it's total genius, and people are just catching on now. And so tell us what you saw that you couldn't explain. You're like, I saw forests in condition that I couldn't explain and finally put it together. What did you see?
Oh, everything from seashells under giant spruce trees that the locals tried to explain were from like ravens and eagles dropping shells on the ground and shattering them so they could get the meat out. Well, it turns out this is mostly lore, and that many, many giant trees in the Pacific Northwest, and I've documented some of this in a book chapter I wrote called it's in the book, Unlearning the Language of Conquest. It's on my website. And I'll make that information available. But anyway, these shell deposits have been fertilizing these trees and growing huge trees in remarkably healthy conditions. There are, of course, also these what they call council trees, which are trees that are shaped very weird, but very strange branching patterns we find in the Pacific Northwest. And then there was just, when I got to California and started looking at the forest here, just nothing made sense in terms of seeing, 300, 400, 500-year-old oak trees growing essentially in an oak savanna with none of the essentially developmental stages between a grassland and an old-growth oak forest present. These are anomalies that can only be explained by regular use of fire by the native peoples. So, yeah, and I'm sure we'll have time to talk more about some of these patterns of forests. It's particularly trees. I want to, at some point, take a time and talk about this phenomenon of ancestor trees that were obviously pollarded and tended in ways that help facilitate the collection and production of acorn.
Well, definitely we will get to that. And in case you have just tuned in, dear listener, you are listening to KSQD Santa Cruz on 90.7 FM. You might be tuning in at ksqd.org. This is Talk of the Bay. I am Christine Barrington, and my guest is Dr. Lee Klinger of Sudden Oak Life, a movement and a suite of practices employed to regenerate native forest health through fire mimicry. Dr. Klinger is an earth systems scientist, and he teaches these practices through workshops in the region and in partnership with local indigenous groups who have long understood the life-giving power of cyclical fires. And so it sounds like you're wanting to maybe go into continuing to talk about traditional ecological knowledge, and then we will get to your fire mimicry techniques, because I think those got born out of what you were observing, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That these ecosystems that you describe from the early accounts of the explorers that are essentially park-like productive ecosystems that the descriptions of which sometimes just bring tears to my eyes. The beauty that's described and the abundance of wildlife and waterfowl, and the beauty of that is like that's we already know that works, right? This is like not a hypothetical, that productive landscapes like that can be created and maintained over thousands of years. So to me, that's the beauty of all this. We're not even conjecturing whether this can work or not. It's already been shown. Right. And so pretty much once I became very clear about all the different patterns of the redwoods and the, finding ancient 1,000+ year old redwood groves right next to chaparral, Manzanita chaparral, which is a fairly young ecosystem, next to a very young grassland. These kinds of distinct boundaries just cannot be explained by simple natural fire behavior.
Right.
These are
in this
boundaries that were created.
Yeah, in this presentation you gave, you show a photo of a big giant sequoia, and there's some trees around it and all these things. And you said if you took this picture 200 years ago, what you would see is a giant sequoia. That's it in this frame.
Yeah.
And
right.
And there's this really wonderful film. I've put a link to it on the page for this show, and it's called Tending the Wild, and it's all about traditional ecological knowledge and about fire in particular. And what they talked about is that the native peoples were just starting fires all the time, everywhere they went. So Ron Good, who is a tribal chairman, talks about this, that settlers, as they were coming through, were just saying there's just fire happening all the time, and they didn't understand why. And I have a little clip from that film because I thought, because your work is so intimately connected with Indigenous science, really, knowledge, I wanted to bring in the voice of an Indigenous person talking about fire. So this is Ron Good, and this is from a documentary called Tending the Wild from KCET.
You have to know how to work with fire. When you're my age, I take my young ones out, smell the smoke, smell it. That's grass fire. Smell the smoke, that's a house burning. Smell the smoke, that's tires burning. That's a wood fireplace burning. You should be able to smell every single different kind of smoke. The animals teach their young to do that. But if there's no fire, they can't teach them to do that. That's why we have to burn. That's why we have to keep the fires going, so that all parts of life understand what it is that we're doing with fire. The North Fork Mono and most of the other Mono groups have been here for 15,000 years. When the Indian was out on the land, they always burned. So the use of fire comes through your land so that it can take care of your resources and give you new ones. Cultural burning is exactly that. So when we burn, we are burning to perfect this resource to supply resources for our culture, rather it be food, medicine, fiber, sticks, basketry material.
That was the Honorable Ron Good, tribal chairman of the North Folk Mono tribe. And I just love listening to him, and I learned so much. And these fires not only allowed, this production of all the materials they need for life, but it also raises the water table, which I found astonishing to learn. And you think that would be obvious to us, but apparently it's not.
Yeah, a lot of the problems with fire suppression have created heavily overgrown forests and essentially more tree biomass on our hillsides than used to be here. Unfortunately, a lot of it isn't healthy biomass, and it's also quite a bit of a fire hazard. But before it burns, these trees are taking a lot of water out of the soils. And by using fire to thin these forests, more water is retained in the soil and less is evaporated off. And there's many accounts that I've read about streams that 100, 200 years ago used to be perennial that are no longer perennial. They're ephemeral due to the seasonal drying out from the heavy evaporation from that heavy forest cover.
And you know what's an interesting thing right now is I hear often we need to reduce carbon emissions by planting trees. And I always think I don't think it's just that easy, just planting trees indiscriminately. There's probably a lot more involved. And now I'm seeing we need to really thin the trees, which is part of what you do with your Sudden Oak Life process, which we're going to get to. But before we do, you had mentioned wanting to talk about these ancestor trees that were tended and cultivated. Share with us what you wanted to say about that.
Yeah, just that there are trees all over California, hundreds of thousands of them, I'm guessing still, that date from the age of the local tribes being present on the land, that show signs of being pollarded, meaning they were cut repeatedly when they were young to encourage many lateral branches to go out and create a shape, a broad spreading canopy that had many uses. First of all, it created a much larger area for shade underneath, but also it created essentially a way to be able to harvest the acorns better by having large lateral branches stretching out instead of main branches going very high up. And it just, pollarding is a standard practice in the fruit and nut orchard industry. It's the most efficient shape of maximizing fruit, or in this case, acorn production, having a more open centered canopy and lots of lateral branches having been developed. And you can really see these. Oftentimes the tree will have one big stem, and usually these are very large trees because they're old trees. And then all of a sudden 4, 5, 6 branches will come out at about 6 to 8 feet in height. And then if you look at the younger trees nearby, same species, same place, same environment, you'll see they tend not to grow that way. They tend to have more of a typical erect growth form that oak trees are known to have. So that's something to pay attention to. And I think if more people had an eye for these ancestor trees, you realize that these are Native American artifacts, living artifacts that are still with us. And I emphasize them because I actually take quite an effort to identify and take care of these trees. Oftentimes they're not in very good health, and they need particular attention, as all the trees do.
There's such a feeling that arises in me listening to you and imagining the reality of this and thinking wow, we could go meet these trees, and they're a work of art, a work of love, and imagine all the people who have sat underneath those trees and all the people who have survived living off the production. My understanding is it takes about 1,000 pounds of acorns per person, and one of these really big trees could provide about 10,000 pounds of acorns a year, which is incredible. And so I thank you for bringing that up. I have never heard that to that extent. This is a completely new bit of understanding for me. And so when you talk about tending the trees, you are talking about a very specific process. And we're going to take a short break. And when we get back, we're going to talk about the suite of techniques that you have developed to tend to the health and well-being of our wonderful oak forests. So I am Christine Barrington with Talk the Bay. You are listening to KSQG Santa Cruz on 90.7, and my guest is Dr. Lee Klinger of Sudden Oak Life. And we will be back with more from Dr. Klinger right after this short break. Welcome back to Talk of the Bay on KSQD Santa Cruz. I'm Christine Barrington, and my guest is Earth System Scientist Dr. Lee Klinger. We're talking about fire mimicry practices that, if understood and widely used, could help restore our local forests to thriving health. So, Lee, let's get into your fire mimicry suite of practices. How did you develop this? What is it? We're going to take some time to get into it.
Yeah, so recognizing that I don't do cultural burning, all right, and this is where I defer to the native leaders in the field that ultimately prescribed fire cultural burning is going to be the way that we manage large areas of forest in the right way. Basically, the methods that I've developed essentially just come from the recognition that fire was used wisely, and wisely doesn't begin to do it justice. It was a science. They had Native people still have half a dozen different burning regimes just for chaparral, and maybe twice that many for oak forests. So we're talking all kinds of different ways to burn, season, time of day. It's a very sophisticated practice that I don't want to pretend I know even that much about. I do some burning. I do burn piles. I get places ready so that they can be culturally burned. But I'm bringing this up because ultimately everything I'm going to be talking about hopefully can lead eventually to the reestablishment of fire back into the landscape.
Right, because actually I can see why you're emphasizing this, because so you're going to describe a very particular practice that works for trees, individual trees, and but to tend a whole forest is going to require this very sophisticated cultural burning practices. And it is my understanding that in January of this year, a law was passed in California that gives the Indigenous peoples the absolute right to do these cultural burns. So I'm sure they're working closely with the state, but now it's recognized by law as something that they can do that non-Native people cannot do. Is that correct? Do you know about that?
Yeah, I do, and they are taking it. They're not holding back at all. There's workshops going on. In fact, if people want, there's T-Rex workshops that are being held by Bill Tripp and others up in Northern California. Anyway, there's a whole culture of learning how to do prescribed fires and cultural burning that I highly recommend, especially a lot of the youth.
Yes.
To get out there and learn this stuff. I mean, I was a volunteer firefighter, and I did all that stuff when I was younger, but I wish I'd had this kind of training that they have now. I'd be way ahead of the game.
Right. It's so empowering. It's exciting. And so you've mentioned some of these workshops. And what I want to say on the air is perhaps you can give me that information and I can put it in the show notes in case people want to follow up on that. So.
Yes. So.
Let's pivot to your fire mimicry practices, though, like what it is that you do.
Fire mimicry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So basically, I took a careful look at what fire does ecologically to the landscape, to the soils, to the plants, and not just to the trees and vascular plants, but also to the mosses and lichens. Pretty much a kind of a whole ecosystem approach and understanding. And this took a lot of years of research. I worked at the National Center for Atmospheric Research with a team of scientists, and we specialized in the chemical ecology of oak forests. And that's actually how I eventually came to California, because people had heard of my work with oak forests. And when sudden oak death started happening and oak trees started dying, they gave me a call. And so anyway, my understanding with oaks and their health is that they actually are succumbing to a number of things related to fire suppression. One is acidification of soils. So soils gradually acidify through time. If there's not a disturbance like a fire or a landslide or a flood or something, soils will gradually acidify. It's just part of the aging process. You can almost think of it as, even in human terms, a lot of issues with aging have to do with acidification. And the same is true with ecosystems. So as ecosystems age, they tend to acidify. The soils acidify. A lot of the sources of acidity tend to increase. Mosses and lichens are sources of acidity. Keep in mind that mosses and lichens normally are very well controlled by fire. You would never get a buildup of heavy moss and lichen cover in a regularly burned landscape. Mosses and lichens are super sensitive to smoke and the chemicals in smoke. And of course, the heat and the flames also would burn them off. So this really heavy buildup of mosses and lichens is not really natural over the many thousands of years these forests, our oak forests, have developed. And so some of what I'm doing is trying to replenish the alkaline nutrients that are being lost from the soils due to the buildup of organic acids in the soils, as well as mosses and lichens that are growing in the environment. So key element is alkalinizing the soils, and a lot of this could be traced back to various studies that have used lime and also seashells. There's studies showing how trees growing on shell middens, these accumulations of shells that I was talking about earlier, that the Native Americans created, are hugely productive and healthy. And so a lot of evidence around the importance of soil minerals, alkalizing the soils. Then there's also the issue of the trunk getting essentially covered in mosses and lichens. So one of the things we're doing is applying a lime wash. And after taking the mosses and lichens off with a wire brush, we apply a lime wash, which helps essentially create an environment that helps deter insects and diseases, because that's often the place where a lot of the problems, the pests and diseases, affect the large trees, is in the main trunk. So we focus our work on the trunk, and then, of course, oftentimes before we can do that, a lot of these forests are overgrown. So we need to go in and actually thin and clear and essentially create an environment where if a fire burns through, it doesn't create a canopy fire and kill all the trees. What we're trying to do is create a situation by clearing and thinning where if a fire does come through, it stays on the ground and doesn't kill the mature trees. And and just to talk sometime a brief bit about the carbon balance and all this. People will comment like, well, you're going in and cutting out a lot of wood and removing a lot of carbon from the forest, and that's true. However, of course, a lot of that wood we reuse. We create biochar, which is a fertilizer that we can spread around the trees. Some of it we can use for firewood, others we can mulch and create a nice mulch cover. So that's all reusable. But what's important is that by doing this work, now you've created an environment where if a fire comes through, you're not going to lose all the carbon in the mature trees. So you've actually created conditions that are going to preserve carbon as opposed to losing it all in a catastrophic fire.
Right, and you're creating conditions for a whole ecosystem, and it's hard to quantify all the benefits to all of us when you've got thriving trees that are benefiting, there's soil life, that doesn't get destroyed when you've got these catastrophic fires, and there's insect life. It's just it's a total picture. And I also thought it was interesting in your film that you talked about that they believe also that the birds with your lime wash, they can see the insects that might attack the trees and eat them up. And it was a really interesting journey to learn about all the techniques that you use. And there's even more to it. So I understand you do tree surgery as well.
Yeah, and just to back up about the lime wash, I've studied lime wash. I've traveled, quite a bit around the world, um, and I've talked to many cultures that use lime wash on their trees, and some of this that I've just described about the birds picking the insects off the trees. A lot of this is lore from the people, though, that have been using this for hundreds of years. So this lime wash practice is not something new. It's actually quite an ancient practice that
interesting. I was wondering about that because you've worked all over the world, and so one of the questions I had for you is, what have you learned about oak tending from other cultures? Because people have been cultivating oaks for their food benefit all over the world, right?
Yeah, and of course in China I learned quite a bit. I studied oak forests in China, old growth oak forests, and of course a lot of the trees were lime washed, not in the old growth because they weren't being tended anymore. But the old growth forests had pollarded oaks, and it was very clear these oaks had been tended in the past by the local people in China. So yeah, there's evidence pretty much wherever there's oaks of tending. Um, and but yeah, we're off the subject of lime wash. You wanted to talk about surgeries. That's a fun new addition to the toolkit.
Right, but necessary. So where I live, we have some very beautiful old oaks. This past year we lost one, and it was like losing a family member. And I was telling my husband, like, wow, had we known Lee, we could have saved that tree, because we had been watching it and having tree experts come out, from the very beginning, and they'd like spray it with stuff, but they didn't have this process. And so when you described doing this surgery to take out the canker, it was really fascinating to watch that process. So could you describe it for our listeners? But actually, before you do, I want to take a moment to reintroduce the show, because if you've just tuned in, gotten into your car, you're listening to KSQD on 90.7 FM in Santa Cruz. And this is Talk of the Bay. I'm Christine Barrington, and my guest is Dr. Lee Klinger of Sudden Oak Life. So, Lee, how do you do surgery on a tree?
Right. So when I started doing these fairly basic fire mimicry treatments involving, alkaline mineralization of the soils, add a compost tea to the fertilization process, applying lime washes, the diseased trees, the trees with cankers, they would get better, but the cankers wouldn't go away. The disease was still in the tree. And I started thinking, well, how might nature take care of that canker? And of course, kind of the semi-obvious answer was, well, a fire might burn through, and the heat from the fire might heat up the disease enough to kill it, or give the tree some advantage to fight off the disease. Anyway, it just became clear that it was a fair attempt to just go in and try to surgically remove the infected tissue with an axe and other power tools, and then cauterize the wound. So I go in with a blowtorch afterwards and essentially turn the whole wound black, heat it up. That black surface essentially creates a nice charred, fairly antiseptic surface that disease organisms couldn't re-enter. And just to be safe, I then put a mineral poultice over the wound. And if I can get to the tree soon enough, if canker isn't too large, the surgeries are working. I have clear results now showing surgical wounds, smaller ones, healing up over the course, completely healing up closed over the course of 5 years.
Yeah, so, you have some great photographs showing
I'm excited
that.
about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
So it's definitely something that needs a lot more development. I'm sure there's different poultices that could be used, but it definitely is an option, especially for the smaller cankers. And some people have called me in and actually had me do, very large surgeries because the tree is so important to them. And I tell them I'm not sure it can work. And the jury's still out on some of them. It has not worked on some of them for the very large cankers. They're just, it's really not clear yet whether a large canker can be dealt with surgically or not. But, I'm seeing some promise in some of the larger surgeries. Definitely, though, it's working if we can catch the canker when it's small enough to be able to get it all out.
Well, it has to be really satisfying to see a tree bounce back, just like, we're so satisfied when we can help somebody we love heal. And it's great seeing the photographs on your site, which is suddenoaklife.org. You have a lot of photographs where you've worked with oaks and I believe madrones right here in Felton and all over this area. It's exciting to see that because I'm looking at the oak forest around where we live and I'm identifying all the trees that look like they're struggling. I'm seeing the moss on their trunks and I'm like, well, I had no idea that wasn't good for them. And so in taking care of the trees, you trim them, you thin out the area, you burn all the trimmings. And it reminds me also of something I heard Ron Good talk about. The process that the native people would do was similar, right? They would thin the trees, thin the branches. They would pile everything up at the base of the trees, which were larger, healthier trees, and then they would burn it. And he said the smoke would rise up and it would smoke out all the pests and the insects and kind of harden, the heat would harden the tree. And he said, and we only allowed about 14 trees per acre. And it was so precise, and I was so excited, and I'm like, I want to do this. And for one person, for one family, it's who doesn't, know how to do this. You've got to hire people. We're going to get into how people might affect this, but it's so empowering to know what you can do to take care of these trees who take care of us.
Yeah, it is. It's a really rewarding work. And I do, as you noticed, as you mentioned, put a fair amount of effort in photo documenting my results. So, I take, good pictures and relocate them pretty precisely and yearly intervals at the same time of day. And I don't get it always exactly right, but it's fun process to go back to a tree time and time again and watch its improvement.
Well, so in that vein, you now have you're working to develop these techniques. You're experimenting. You're getting some good results, and you're now trying to pass this knowledge along. And how is that going? How do you do that? There might be people listening right now saying, "I want to do this." How are you disseminating this knowledge and skill?
Yes. So first of all, I want to give a shout out to Santa Cruz Permaculture. So I do about 4 workshops, half-day workshops with them every year for the different permaculture design classes that they have through the year. So that's one way to get a flavor of what I'm doing. It's not we go in and do a treatment on a tree and talk a lot about this stuff. It's not really a full-on training of the technique, but it's definitely a good introduction to the science and practice of fire mimicry. So that's Santa Cruz Permaculture, their permaculture design course.
It's a phenomenal.
It's SantaCruzPermaculture.com. Yeah.
Yes, Anne and Lydia, they're amazing. We've had them on the show.
Yeah.
A couple of amazing individuals that are making a big impact on this region. So, and they have a year-long permaculture course. So, shout out, definitely.
Yay. Mm-hmm. And Anne and Lydia were also involved in our intensive workshop, which we just had in November at Indian Canyon. So this is a workshop that I do once a year It's hosted by Indian Canyon and supported by Eco Camp Coyote, which is a ecological restoration camp that is just they essentially create a infrastructure that is fairly fossil fuel free in this 3-day campout event where we set up a kitchen, bring in a mobile kitchen, and do this amazing event, vegan, mostly fossil fuel free. And that's a 3-day workshop we do every fall. This year we had it in November. Next year it'll probably be October. It was a little chilly in November this year. We've done 3 of these so far, and so it's not been the date's not been decided yet, but it'll probably be mid-October next year for the 3-day workshop at Indian Canyon. And that's also in conjunction with the Esselen tribe. They were involved this year along with Canyon from the Mutsunaloni tribe, and a number of other Indigenous folks participated this past year. A lot of young, eager folks wanting to work in the woods, and that's an exciting workshop. You know, it's a camp out. We go deep into traditional ecological knowledge, just trying to interpret the land. It's
it looks you have
and we actually work the land.
Right, you work the land. Again, people can go to your website, suddenoaklife.org. They can see lots of photographs and how powerful that you are doing this in partnership, I believe, with Canyon Sayer Roots and then another woman who's from the Esselen tribe. And they have this beautiful circular space set up. It's very ceremonial. I can only imagine how powerful it is for people to be learning this knowledge intimately with the people who knew this knowledge and cultivated it for thousands of years.
Yeah, and that circle is surrounded by half a dozen ancestor trees, trees that were collared and intended by the Ohlone people for hundreds of years. So yeah, it's a special event. So keep your eye on my website, and we'll announce it. And then there is one more event coming up on March 11th, which is, I think it's a Saturday in March, maybe a Sunday. March 11th, we will be gathering for one day at Indian Canyon and going over the processing of the materials that we cleared. So most of it will be pile burning and biochar production, which is this is an important process to learn, because the biochar that we produce from burning the materials we clear is a really, really good soil medium for helping improve soil fertility and water holding capacity in the soil. So we make this biochar and then spread it around the trees that we've been working on. So that'll be March 11th. Mm-hmm. Yep. And watch for that on my website. In fact, we'll probably have that finalized in the next few weeks.
So biochar comes up a lot if you read anything about permaculture. And it seems to me like, well, I did a permaculture course once, and it was a pretty particular process to produce the biochar. You had to keep the fire to special temperature range. How do you do that in a burn pile? And why say a little bit more about why it's important, because everybody could learn about this. All of us could be using this more in our gardens if we understood how valuable it is.
Right. So the biochar produced in just a normal burn pile is no less usable and beneficial than biochar produced in other ways. It's just that in a burn pile, you don't get as much biochar produced.
Okay.
But it's still, you get quite a bit, and it's a way to get rid of the material that you've cleared, reduce the fire hazard, and create some amount of fertilization without getting too technical. Mm-hmm. But we will also be demonstrating biochar, essentially big circular biochar containers that we burn. They're kind of double-walled containers that we fill with wood, and Those create more biochar, and we'll be using one of those, maybe two of those during the March 11th workshop, and showing how you can augment the amount of biochar that you're producing with the burn piles.
All right. So if people are interested in biochar, this is the workshop to go to. Wonderful. And so that's also a training. Anything else before we pivot to some last words?
Yeah, and I think this the other thing to add about the workshop is that there's a whole safety and set of procedures that need to be aware of when you do burn piles, and so we'll be going over the whole set of different guidelines and ways to do the burn pile and where to do the burn pile and all. That's all part of the process too.
Well, what I love about all this is there's so much skill building, and that's what has been lost. And so I don't want to speak for all white people. There's a lot of skillful people, but a lot of us just don't know much of anything about how to cultivate and tend the world around us. And it's so empowering to get these skills. And all animals feel better about themselves when they feel more competent. And you're increasing our ecological and getting to do this in Indian Canyon also increases cultural competency. So it sounds really compelling. And so, Lee, if somebody's listening and they're like, okay, I can't go to the workshops, but I've got these trees, I would like to have them tended a little bit more like this. Who do they reach out to? Are there people you have trained that people could find? How do ordinary people access this beautiful tree care?
Yeah, I have trained people, and depending on the location, I can refer a couple of the different people that I have trained. I don't have a big army, but definitely in the Santa Cruz area, Monterey County area, I've got a number of people that can get this work done. Probably the best thing to do would be contact me directly. And let's see,
and that's
Lee
at
suddenoaklife.org. Yeah.
Great. And it's also on our show notes.
Yeah,
so
just,
Lee at Sudden
email me directly.
Perfect. Lee at suddenoaklife.org. And then, so as we wrap up the show, I just want to express my appreciation. I have learned so much from looking at your work, and deeply appreciate this marriage or this coming back to traditional ecological knowledge. And there's more to it than just gaining the skills, though, isn't it? There's also something that Stan Rushworth talks about, is that, we sort of have to change our whole attitude toward life itself. One of the things he said in publishing this book called We Are the Middle of Forever is he said, white people just can't come and take these techniques and use them. They sort of have to straighten themselves out as far as their approach toward life. Do you see that in this work that you're doing, this deeper change of approach and attitude toward life itself?
Well, that's a really deep question, and I'm going to answer it real quickly. And that is, Native people have always believed that the earth is a living system. And I was never aware of this concept until I was, in graduate school learning about Gaia theory.
Right.
And I always felt like, gosh, what if from an early age I was taught that the earth was alive, not learning it when I was in my 20s and 30s. And I just am envious how Native people all over the world, Indigenous people all over the world, have viewed the earth as a living being. And that alone kind of fuels me to want to keep doing this work, believing that.
Well, Lee, that's just the perfect note for us to wrap up the show. Our earth is a living being, and we're learning more and more ways to care for her and be a part of a thriving world instead of a world in crisis. So thank you so much for joining us here on Talk of the Bay.
Thank you, Christine, for having me. It's been a pleasure.